Hello and welcome to Talk Gnosis. I'm Jason Memmel, one of the co-hosts here. I'm joined by Deacon John, and today we're going to be talking to Ike Baker, part of the founding and driving force of the Arcanum podcast. It's been a fabulous conversation with him we've had on his show, and now we've decided to return the favor, have him here. Ike, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I love talking with you guys. I wish we lived closer to each other.
Oh my God, yes. That's the for those that didn't know, we had a previous conversation that I think is coming out soon, and I think we had a pre-show conversation and a post-show conversation that were as rich as our recording. That's already happened again here, so you guys are in for, I think, a heck of a treat. But yeah, so Ike, before we kind of dive into some of the really more meaty subjects, you, like us, are a media maker in the esoteric world. What's a bit of your own history as a practitioner, as an esotericist, as a media maker in that? Like, what led you to Arcanum? What kind of keeps you going? That kind of thing.
Yeah. Good questions. Difficult questions. I've been called many things in my lifetime, but never brief. So I'm going to try and do my best here. My basic background is it started out simple and got more complex, right? Like a lot of people in these fields and these communities. But the first thing that I ever got involved with in terms of esoteric initiation and ceremonial, etc., was the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, the Cicero lineage. I kind of stumbled into that. I've told this story before, so mea culpa, but my aunt had a tenant who died. She threw herself in front of a train, and may she rest in peace. And it turns out she was a very sweet lady, but she was a hoarder. And it wasn't like a filthy apartment. It was clean, but she just had these massive stacks of books. So my aunt called me up. I'm sure many of us have moved and are occultists, and so know how deceptively heavy those books, those boxes can be. Said, hey, come give me a hand with this stuff. And I said, okay. I brought a buddy, and I saw a book just stuck out. The picture, the cover design just jumped out at me. And I still have it. It's on my bookshelf over there across the room. And it was a little book called The Oracle of Kabbalah by Richard Seidman. And I asked her if I could take it. She said, sure. I walked around my neighborhood in a day and read the book. It wasn't that big. And at the end, I was like, you know what? I don't think I really know what this is any more than before I read the book, but I think it's important. So I went online and used the yellow or white pages when people used to do that. And I typed in Long Island Kabbalah group because I grew up on Long Island. And I got this guy's information, and he said that group doesn't meet anymore, but there's this other thing. And the other thing was the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. And at first, I kind of laughed myself out of the room. I was like, these people think they're doing like, Harry Potter stuff. But I ended up going back despite myself, and I wasn't even 100% sure why. But I allowed myself to, and this was really the beginning of my initiation in fact, rather than merely in form, was that I began to take my postmodern, Cartesian, hyper-reductive, hyper-rational skepticism, and I just didn't allow it to come in and like wipe everything off of the table and flip the table. I allowed it to be there, right? I could feel it yelling at me from across the room, but I said, look, this has to, for now, have its own domain of authority. And then I need to be able to create a space for something else to speak to me. And that something else really was what I had before that voice started talking to me. And that's my subjective experience and everything that comes with that, which is, things like intuition and creativity. So that was how I allowed myself to get through. And I truly, I became a person of very deep faith. And through the Golden Dawn, I'm sure it's no surprise to a lot of people here. I'm not spoiling anything, but the inner order of the Golden Dawn. You take the 5-6, the 5 equals 6 ritual. The Golden Dawn is just, the Golden Dawn is just an outer court. It's just,
I'm kidding.
Yeah. So, but the inner order is Rosicrucian. And for anybody that's ever read that ritual, it explores heavily the mysteries of Christ and of Christian Rosenkreuz. But so even before I had gotten to the 5-6, I felt this inclination to return to my roots, which were Catholic, right? I went
Mm,
through all of the Roman Catholic. I went through all those initiations as an infant at baptism and confirmation, communion, etc. I returned to my roots there, and at the same time, I received a diaconate office from somebody
mm,
who's involved in the Templar Church, the old Templar Church, uh, and it was part of this kind of elaborate, I don't know, thing. This, it had its own ritual, but then like you had to be, I had to be knighted and all this kind of stuff in order to fit into that mold. But effectively, nothing happened with that for 2 years, and then I moved down to North Carolina. And there was a lively and vibrant church here where I spent, another 4 or 5 years. I was a deacon for a total of 7 years, and until I was able to uh, get my clerical ordination through a different church, I had to incarnate into this particular
mm,
church. So there's all ceremony for that, and then I did that as a deacon, and then I came. They gave me my priestly ordination. So as a deacon down here, I mean, I used to give homily and I used to assist at the altar, and there were even times where I would give the mass with pre-consecrated hosts, and that's when I knew that I wanted to accept an ordination because the first time I gave mass, even though I didn't consecrate, I just started bawling. I felt like I was home, and
mm,
I had found my purpose in life. And like this whole esoteric thing was me climbing up a sheer cliff, and I finally felt like I reached the ledge. So
mm,
it was a beautiful experience, and I've done marriages, I've done baptisms, I've done confirmations. I do mass regularly in Asheville. So yeah, I mean that's Martinism's in there, Freemasonry's in there, but I decided really the main thing for me is my role in the Golden Dawn, which I'm now an administrator, and the Eucharistic and ministerial work that I do through that church. In terms of becoming a content creator, I'm a bit of a Luddite. So I did this, surprised even myself here, but I've kept feeling a pressure to get out there and offer somewhat of an alternative viewpoint to what I had been seeing, which was like Reddit threads where like 16-year-olds were like summoning demons from the Goetia. And I'm like, what is going on here? Now, I'm not like trying to show up and shut down everybody's party, but
no.
at the same time, I'd like to be a guy who's like on the side of the road and like, hey, the road's out ahead. Detour. There's another way. There's a different way to do this
Mm,
if you want to get involved in an alternative spirituality. And I felt like I could see with clarity a lot of like what was going on with the social movements, and that's again a product of initiation, because before initiation, I couldn't see that. I was enmeshed in it, and it's this whole very strange reactionary polarization where people start on one side, and I think in psychology they call that enmeshment, in a family or a community where there's a bunch of rules and there's a bunch of this and that, and then once you come of age around 12 or 13 and you start, your whole life is like your parents took you to this show and they watched this TV show, they listened to this music, they ate this food, and around that time you start saying, well, I like this stuff over here, and maybe I don't like that. What you find a lot of times is then it's called differentiation in psychology, but they can't find a middle ground. They're not
mm,
experienced enough to do so. And so what they do is they go to the opposite extreme, because by contrast, it's the only other alternative to somebody like that. And
mm,
what happens is people tarry there in what I like to refer to as the era of therapeutic blasphemy, and they form entire identities around like what happened to them when they were 15, 16, and they live these lives where they never stop and reevaluate. Initiation provides the liminality for you to see that and to break that, because all you've
mm,
done is you've just set yourself on another enmeshment. So I saw a lot of that going on in the occult communities and realizing like, look, initiation in particular is trying to undo that in you. And so these are some of the first things I decided to talk about when I came out. And so I guess I don't know, true to form for a Catholic, right? I mean, I went on a little bit of a mission, but rather than trying to convert people, sincerely, I just try and offer an alternative viewpoint.
That's amazing. There's so much there that I think resonates, at least with me, probably with John too. Like I know that Gnosis itself has been around a long time, but in a way, we're like the third generation of people involved with it in a way, like or the third, like
Third, maybe
the
fourth.
third. Yeah, exactly. Sort of like Aeon perhaps of Gnosis hosts, but um, the that notion of the mission, particularly of like providing a more providing more nuanced background, I think, like a more nuanced amount of information that isn't part of a reaction. I think that's the thing that I really like, the therapeutic blasphemy. I am taking that. Like I am, I'll credit you.
I took that from Mark Stavish. So
Okay. Um, but yeah, I think there's definitely something there of the I hated this, so now I'm gonna do that.
right. Yeah.
And I think we see it a lot in a lot of Gnostic and esoteric discourse, trying to map the old assumptions on the new form or on the new thing. Like, Gnosticism is just like my previous monotheism experience, but like one step higher. You know what I mean? The demiurge is now the bad guy, and now God is just one step higher. But then, like, so many of the same questions and problems still persist if you don't change the frame. If you're not creating, if you're not getting unmeshed, to kind of use that enmeshment word you were talking about. So that really struck me there. Also, heck, the notion of like a more balanced viewpoint. We often think of balance as it's boring. It's just the middle. No, the balance is a process of tension. You know what I mean? It's like a tight wire walker is not a boring thing to watch, but they're all about balance.
It's certainly probably not a boring thing to do either. They must be
No.
jacked with adrenaline.
Yeah. Oh, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So sorry, I just a whole bunch of things I wanted to react to from that. John, anything that came to mind for you?
Well, I was just happy to hear that your soul was won for Christ through occultism and magic. So that's always a great path to hear. I hope that lots of people out there who are a more Christian persuasion, or even the evangelicals who hate us who find this show, will tune in for that part. Time with evangelicals, just like Jason was saying, for this enmeshment, something that we notice a lot, and this is something I've talked about before. That's maybe a bit controversial, but uh, it's something that I need to talk about a long time to get the ideas across clearly. So forgive me, but I do believe that Gnosticism is very influential, and ideas from it can become unmoored. And they are not ideas that are like Gnosticism or originally from outside of Gnosticism, but come from Gnosticism, but are not connected to the wider system. Really get into our culture, and it's partly because they're unmoored that they sometimes become dangerous. So I would even say, in some Pentecostal conservative evangelical, we're always picking on evangelical. I want to point out evangelical does not mean conservative or fundamentalist. Something like 25% of evangelicals are progressive. Some have liberal theologies. It is a family of traditions. It's a style, right? But obviously, there's a lot of fundamentalist conservative evangelicals. Conservative, I'm talking more about their religion than anything political. Now, I think that the Gospel of John talks about the ruler of this world. And if you listen to April DeConnick, this is originally talking about the demiurge and the demiurge's son, right? Then this gets into evangelicism. I mean, we also have it other places in the Gospels, but particularly the Johannite Gospel, the Johannite cosmos, the dark world, we're strangers within it. So to make a long story short, right, in evangelical Christianity, you have the devil running the world. And it's this idea related to Gnosticism that's become unmoored. So to make a long story short, for to continue your point about enmeshment, more Jason than you, Ike, people come into Gnosticism perhaps from an evangelical background, and they just change the names around. Right? And I think to tie it in finally to what you've been saying, Ike, three people who like to talk a lot, but we all say brilliant things, folks. So you're getting your money's worth on this free podcast. How do we stop that from happening? And I would like to propose, actually, it is initiation. right? So because very few of us are going to be born Gnostics, right? A handful of people are going to be raised in a Gnostic church or raised in a Gnostic community or a Rosicrucian community. It's pretty rare. So that break, that way to get rid of that stuff that you're carrying with you, the baggage from your previous religion, I think that breaking open of initiation might be part of the path, right? Which I think is also saying that if you can, some people are just isolated because of where they are geographically, right? And maybe they're in very cultural communities that just will not allow them to fully embrace the Gnosis. That's the important thing about community. I'm not saying that you have to join a secret order or a Gnostic church. I believe there are other ways to experience
Mhm.
initiation, and there is there's a lot of talk about self-initiation. Maybe that is a thing, but I think it's something separate and something different. I think there is this community aspect to initiation, and this is how we sort of, move past some of the problems that we have with Gnosticism, right? Because a lot of times people are coming in from unhealthy systems, and they're just changing the names of their previous concepts and bringing them in. Where in some ways you almost, and we all do this. This is how the human brain works. I do it, right? But I do believe Gnosticism is weird and different, and you have to get that brain right flexible right away and have some things crack and break open. I don't know if you'd agree, but it's this breaking open, this leaving behind, this new perspective. I think are the important aspects of initiation, which are real. Right now, this as always, we have our safety valve. If you're more of a secularist, I 100% believe that this is completely relevant on a psychological basis, right? A successful initiation has many psychological impacts, right? And as you're
Mhm.
talking about, you often have these, if you're going to have perhaps what people think of as more formal, there is a heightened theatricality, which is meant to have a psychological impact. So those are my rants and ravings on everything previously said since the show has begun.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, very much so, particularly with, not just the idea of initiation, but the psychology of initiation. I tell people a lot of times, right, the Golden Dawn is structured where it's like, and it's kind of similar in the hierarchy of clerical duty and clerical ordination, where the deacon doesn't really, he doesn't consecrate, and the priest consecrates, and then the bishop makes priests. So, and it's uh, it's one of those things. It's kind of similar in the Golden Dawn. In the Outer Order, you're not doing any theurgy, right? Magic applied to theurgy is the techniques of magic applied to spiritual, or really the development of the soul. And the I would say the differentiation, the disenmeshment of the soul, uh, that theurgy, you're not actively doing that. It's being done to you by the ritual initiations, and you choosing to engage in that current, choosing to invoke and saturate your psyche, that's the Greek word for soul.
Mm.
Saturating that in all of the attendant symbolism of what we call an alchemical, or I would say a spiritual alchemy. And that, right? Alchemy, we've got several different iterations of formulae, right? So there's, even though that we have a threefold and a fourfold and a sevenfold trajectory of alchemical stages or phases, it's all based on this dipole of solve et coagula, which is to take apart and to put back together. And so, to your point, yeah, it's the taking apart that happens in the outer order, and then in the inner order, you do the actual theurgic magic. And in the foundational documents for the inner order, it's mentioned multiple times. Like, you might not have realized this, but you're here to do theurgy. You're not even here to become, like, necessarily a better person. You're just like, in a moralizing sense. It literally
Mhm.
says that it's not necessary. It is not necessary to undertake initiation to be merely good, but to be wise. And so the purposes and aims to which your previous efforts must be applied is to the divine theurgia. And it says that in multiple times. So in the outer order, people will say, like, well, then what's going on? And I explain it to them, and they talk about how it's all I kind of explain how the outer order works to people, and they say, "Well, it sounds very psychological," and that's because it is. But to remove a lot of people abstract. They have to toggle this idea of spirituality, and mundane life, when really they're two sides of the same coin. So no physical or even psychological stimulus is devoid of a what I kind of generically call a spiritual effect. It's a cause and effect, and you can't separate them. And there's a reason why. Um, it's called psychology, because
Mm,
a lot of people, they get those terms mixed up. Spirit, soul, what's the well, yeah, we've made a mess of the terms, but anciently, psyche, soul, was defined well as the aggregate totality of the experience of selfhood.
mm,
Everything that you experience in here, in your consciousness, your awareness, your subconscious, all that stuff, that's your soul. And so that's what continues on. It's not necessarily, you're not this waif, Casper the friendly ghost. It's your what we would, I guess, call your the sum totality of your consciousness is survives the physical body. And the Greeks had a term for reincarnation too, metempsychosis. So
mm,
so yeah, there's a psychological component, but a lot of people don't realize, like, it's also doing things. It's changing your soul. It's changing your spiritual reality. And so that's really, really important for people who look at this stuff and say that it's all psychology. And right, from a secular perspective, yes, it's still beneficial. But I would even
mhm,
say, for people who are kind of on the fence, and they have that sort of reductive postmodernist voice that I was telling you guys about earlier, they have
mhm,
that, who's trying to gaslight them out of this stuff. Don't, oh, that's garbage, just bunk them. Leave yourself the room to bear out the consequences, the results of that kind of work. And I think that, more often than not, if you're not forcefully projecting your own expectations, your own desired outcomes, it will prove at least something to you.
Yeah.
there's a something there, but you were saying like the issue of psychology as like sort of a reduction, like, oh, it's just psychology, that kind of thing. It did remind me a bit of Alan Moore saying that we are like that modern society is living among the dismembered corpse of magic, where like we used to uh, magicians, sorcerers, occultists, etc., used to be also the neighborhood psychologist, if that makes sense. Like, you'd be talking to them about the same problems, and that as like as enlightenment progressed, and like we started going, okay, this part's going to be science, and then this part's going to be psychology, and then this part's going to be medicine, and all of these things, that like all that magic was left with was ritual. Now it turns out that that's actually still really powerful, but like I just think it's notable that we as a like culture have tried to secularize and separate, to solve all of those pieces away, and
Yeah,
maybe some
without
coagulate if necessary.
well, yeah, that's the whole thing, is that they never put them back together, because the 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 agent which dissolves something cannot put it back together. I'm not a fan of Aleister Crowley, not even a little bit. But I will say that he did write something. Book 4 was a good book for people who are trying to wrap their head around magic, at least, quote unquote modern magic. So he talks about, how in the tarot, according to these Golden Dawnish attributions, these fin de sieque cultist attributions, the suit of swords or daggers it corresponds to the analytical mind. And a lot of people don't realize this, but they think about analysis, to analyze, and they think like, oh, I'm crunching numbers and the gears are turning. That word, archaically, its meaning, even in Greek, is to take apart. And so
Mm,
therefore, the dagger is an instrument that constantly dissects. And that's what the analytical mind does. But that implement cannot put things back together. It can only cut them into further smaller pieces. It can never ever bring us to a holistic unity, which is what as a populace I think we long for now. I think one of the reasons why we are at such a stage of collective insanity and panic is because we have essentially chopped not just society but the self up. We've osirified the soul and rendered it into an even further state of confusion that we're now
Mm.
reeling, trying everything we can to get back.
There's yeah, so many good pieces there. I've got like, I don't know, a bunch of thoughts. One of I always make the connection that I think art and Alan Moore does this as well, that art and magic slash religion slash etc are probably all working in the same, transmission medium. And I think there might be something about like how, the that that movies are $1 billion industry is because we long to connect with something, and that seems to happen often when we go to movies. Now, this is often like is this imperfect, and it's not. A lot of the people making those movies aren't trying to follow that, but I think there's something. What really strikes me there is just that I think there is something there about uh, that longing for unity, and how what in my mind immediately was that like how it is then how that longing is expressed through how people are searching for meaning, searching for stories to attach themselves to become fans of, you know what I mean? Acolytes, perhaps, of like, Star Wars or Marvel movies or something. Jonathan, any thoughts there before I keep going?
Um, I don't think so. I often harp on the sort of psychological impacts quite a bit to both give people a way in if they are in this more rationalist mode or a more secularist mode, but also for this unity that you and Ike are talking about, right? Which is human beings are very reactive. We're dualistic thinkers, right? So as we fight for mysticism, move in that direction, sort of embrace it, then we lose that balance of understanding, okay, there is this human psyche and these things work on multiple levels, right? So kind of nothing new from me, points I always like to reiterate, but I think they are important and tie in well to themes of what you're both saying, because of our very dualistic stances, right? That there is this putting together, this unifying of ourselves and hopefully our organizations and society that Ike is talking about. I find it quite fascinating. Now, there's obvious problems with the past, right? And there's a lot from the 19th century occultism that we've inherited that has this really utopian view, right, of previous spiritual communities, and that could be completely become a complete myth. You have something like Atlantis, right, but sometimes it's not.
Mhm.
Sometimes it's the ancient brotherhoods who lived in a society which was perfect. Human beings are close to the earth and close to themselves and close to each other, yada yada yada. So you have one extreme. Then the other extreme is, oh, you like the past. You must like the babies dying of tuberculosis, and you love racism because the past is more racist, right? So very very common extremes where instead that this very I would say rational balanced Jason, since you were talking about balance, is we can cherry pick. Like the past isn't coming back
Mhm.
regardless, right? But we can see what's good there, what was figured out before us. Hey, it's a lot less work. People have already done the work, and then we can incorporate that as moderns with the best insights of the 21st century. I find that this is a very common sense is always common sense to the people who think something is common sense, right? There really is no such thing as common sense. It's always something that someone says when they want to make an argument or a point. To be honest, so it's a very
Mhm.
deceptive term. But I find this to be a common sense perspective, but I find it's one that's not really common out there. So it's not
Hmm.
common sense.
Mhm.
I just wanted to highlight some of those things, right? Because I'm responding to uh, difficulties that people are having out there, and I think that
Mhm.
there are
Mhm.
ways to help. I think we do have some ways forward, and I think that that's the other thing as well that we're seeing more and more is these occult, Gnostic, and mystical traditions starting to, in healthy ways, have more dialogue with the outside world and with systems of knowing that have been developed over the last couple centuries and sometimes even decades. But I don't know if it's time to move on. I did, Jason. A lot of people think of us as the National Enquirer of the Gnostic world. We're all about controversy. We're a bit of a tabloid. We're always chasing the ambulances. Jason and I are always out with our cam running down the street to see which occultist has poisoned himself with mercury in the alchemy lab. And you mentioned both in our last show and a bit offline that your embrace of Gnosticism in the Gnostic tradition, the capital G, is sometimes controversial, or you've had pushback, or sometimes you're a
Yeah.
bit quiet about some of the Gnostic stuff that you're into. Can you talk to us about that? Are you comfortable
Yeah.
doing that? And maybe to tell us about that, and maybe tell us why, and tell us how you get around that.
Yeah, I mean, well, yeah, I'm totally comfortable talking about it. There's a couple of things about Gnosticism that you all know that make it very hairy, right? You talk about Gnosticism, and it depends on the audience, but you say the word Gnosticism or Gnostic Mass, and you get people who are automatically assume like, oh, he's talking about Crowley,
Mm.
or then like, or somebody else that might say, oh, he's a Gnostic, he knows Samael Ayon Weor, and like other people and it's just kind of like, no, none of that actually. And it's the problem with it's a major problem with the term, is that it's kind of like Rosicrucianism.
Mm.
Right? Pascal Beverly Randolph had some quote to the effect of saying, I studied Rosicrucianism. I loved its teachings. Therefore, I called myself the Rosicrucian. And through all my writings and everything I put out there, people thought they were learning Rosicrucianism, but really it was just PB Randolph's, wisdom. And so a lot of Rosicrucianism is like that. And I think it's the
Mm.
same thing with Gnosticism. Gnosticism it's a hijacked, it's a co-opted term. Whereas when I came to understand the actual Gnostic doctrines of the Sethians, the Valentinians, the Basilidians, these early texts, it was not, for the first time in my life, maybe the second time in my life, I had that experience where, that the Platonists would call aletheia, which in modern Greek means truth. But the
Mm.
etymology of that word is alethe, right? The lethe means forgetfulness, and
Mhm.
alethe means not forgetting, which means remembering. And so Plato talks about how it's exactly that. That is what he calls paideia, which is the education of the soul. You're not learning anything new; you're just remembering. And when
Mm.
I was exposed to those, it was just a very, very unique, and significant like experience. It was an existential thing that happened. It was not, oh, that makes sense. It was actually, that doesn't make sense rationally, but I know it's true. So despite myself,
Mm.
and that to me is Gnosis.
Yeah.
That to
Mhm.
me is Gnosis, is that despite appearances, I somehow understand this to be true, or I somehow now have this knowledge. Because the knowledge itself is like what we were talking about off camera earlier, it transcends discursive reasoning. The
Mhm.
discursive intellect cannot grasp this stuff, so we're forced to use analogies, symbolism. When people think symbolism, they think pictures. Narratives are symbolic. We call them
Mm.
myths. The gestures are symbolic. Movements are symbolic. Especially if in ritual, in liturgy. So, we have to employ these things in order to talk about these higher truths. And I think that Gnosticism, in the primary sources, introduces us to a very important thing that actually is not unique to Gnosticism. I think that
No. Yeah.
Gnosticism and early, I mean, if you look at Catholicism and you look at any early form of Christianity, you look at uppercase O Orthodoxy, it's basically Gnosticism. It's just death to the world. The only difference is that they think that that the demiurge is evil in some iterations, right? Because not everybody thought that. The Valentinians certainly didn't think that it was intentionally malicious. But that's really the only difference, and there are ways for accounting for that. If you go back to the Platonic and Neoplatonic sources, you can figure out exactly where they got this stuff from.
Totally.
It's all there, so it's it resonated with me. And so I started out in believe, as I mentioned, the Old Templar Church, not quintessentially Gnostic. When I got down to Asheville, that's when the Gnosticism started happening, because I studied with somebody I was working with somebody in these orders and in the church who was a Bentley Layton was his mentor, and then I was the head priest who was sort of training me he had trained through seminary through the AJC many years ago, where he had that kind of Gnostic training, and was now doing this thing under this bracket, this church. And initially there was a lot of talk of it being a Gnostic church. It kind of resolved itself to now, okay, it's pre-Nicene Christianity, because Gnosticism now bears this connotation somehow of anti-Semitism. So that's another reason why people are like, don't toss that filth on me anymore. People nowadays you can make up any kind of, you can attribute any kind of meaning to any word. It's not, we use everything like playthings in the modern day. And that's why we can't have anything nice. It's like a bunch of idiot children breaking things. I don't want to use it this way. I like it this way. It's like, well, now it's broken. Now it's useless. It's useless. So I don't really subscribe to the idea that there is anything inherently anti-Semitic in Gnosticism at all whatsoever. So I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid to say that I consider myself a Gnostic, but I also think that there is some nuance that a lot of quote unquote Gnostics are missing. I think that, and we can get into that if you want. You in order to understand this stuff, you have to deeply know Platonism and Neoplatonism. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to make heads or tails. Somebody left in a comment section of an interview I did about Gnosticism. He said, "This sounds like Christian fan fiction." It's like, yeah, because you have no context. Of course it does.
Well,
Yeah,
Jonathan has said that before. Not in a derogatory sense, but in the sense of like fan fiction, in that sense of playfulness. And John, I'm basically just speaking for you now.
I don't even think that it's my line either. I can't even remember where I got it from. But if you like it, Jason, I said it originally.
Great.
Whoever, if you hear somebody else say it, I said it first. But yes, as a sort of creative participatory aspect to it. But yeah, the Plato thing, it's a deeply Platonic tradition, and those who don't like the term Gnosticism or Gnostic, we'll talk about those earlier thinkers, like particularly Valentinus or even Marcion, who I don't think is quite a Gnostic, but as Platonic Christians. And there is this great. There's a scholar that we've had on the show, Agata Robeson, and we didn't really get into it in that show, but she talked about Gnosticism being very ancient, and it always goes hand in hand with monotheism. If you create any kind of monotheism, you're going to get a Gnosticism, right? No matter what. And the Gnosticism that we know of as Gnosticism obviously is deeply Jewish, but it is partly a reaction to Platonic monotheism, if you ask me, because that is enormous. People sort of miss that there is this very important monotheistic movement 2,000 years ago, because the Platonists really do start to move in that direction. And you can call it something else besides monotheism if you like, but there is one supreme God, and in some forms, what we call gods are masks for this God, right? So this is I think the Gnosticism we have is partly a reaction to that monotheism. But Ike, it's a whole different show. Maybe you can even come on it. I might even do maybe a mini series, and we'll talk about quote unquote anti-Semitism and Gnosticism, because I agree with you. Gnosticism is deeply not anti-Semitic, and I do believe that what we call Gnosticism is originally a Jewish movement.
Yes.
still pre-Christian and it's Jewish, and it's still deeply Jewish, right? The way that they talk about Scripture and think about Scripture and argue about Scripture is a deeply Jewish way of engaging with religion. And that is, even though I said if you have monotheism, Gnosticism would be general.
I think the thing that I was thinking about regarding the notion of Gnosticism as a problematic term, or what that like what that's involved with, is something that Jonathan and I have talked about, is Gnosticism as like a genre or as an approach rather than as a tradition, a specific tradition. Because like the Valentinians didn't call themselves Gnostics, like, and I think there is the term is useful, but it's useful as a genre or an approach.
Yeah, it's
So
kind of
like,
things like this are useful for people who know what they're doing with the terms. It's kind of like a very very specific and sharp type of knife is really only utilized well by a chef or something like that. So
yeah,
so
yeah,
they can be they can be used irresponsibly, but I think everybody here kind of knows what they're talking about.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, now here's the thing: we don't know what we're talking about, which, at least in the sense of that, it's a thing that cannot be truly described, which is gnosis. Which is kind of this like kind of hot button question that Jonathan and I have been grappling with, and it's come up in a couple of our shows. You and I, or the three of us rather, talked about it on your show as well. But just that, like that thing, like I'm thinking about your story earlier of discovering this book, walking around reading it, feeling like, holy crap, there's something here that I am remembering that I didn't know I forgot, in a way. To kind of go back to your other note there too. I know that, like, even myself, like I've said it before on the show, but like very quickly, my story of Gnosticism is encountering the terms through a Dungeons and Dragons campaign that a friend of mine used the Nag Hammadi as inspiration, and he's an atheist. And I was like, "Holy crap!" I'm so compelled by some of the symbolism here, and it's resonating with my experience as an artist of this feeling, this deep feeling of recognition, of remembering that happens when I'm making theater art. And yet that feeling I had, or that I have still when I'm making a production and it's really cooking, or that you had then, when you were walking around reading this book, and then you still have elements of now, I'm sure, even now in this conversation, I'm sure of ideas that are close to something but are not fully touchable. John, I'm sure there's resonances here with you as well. But like, what is that? What's that thing we're reaching for, that where words fail? Like you mentioned earlier, symbolism as a way to talk about a thing that's um, the that you can't fully describe, or that rationality, that clear language will never fully express. Um, yeah. So what's that? What's the divine spark made of? Simple, easy question.
Well, I mean, I tend to err on the side of the Hermetists say that God is one and his substance is light. So the spark is definitely light, but I will say, um, again, I one of the things I think that I do well, and I think many of the people I speak with, including yourselves, do well, but that I had to really work hard at is to articulate these often, you know, abstract,
Mm,
just uh, awkward concepts and ideas, things that really they either go way over people's head and come across as like esoteric, or they sort of rattle a cage a little bit. So I
mm,
had to find a way to really be able to succinctly articulate a lot of these experiences, and so I got better at that. But uh, still, there was this unspeakable impulse that I could only describe as something calling out to me, and my reaction was to reach back to it. Now, initially, it was through storytelling, then through art and music, right? I was a musician for most of my life. And then it came to me through magic, and then finally through the liturgy of the Eucharist. And these are the ways that we reach back to this thing that is calling to us, that is beckoning us. But I found another set of tools to more deeply elaborate this and articulate it when I began studying Platonism and Neoplatonism, because what that basically tells us, and what I believe is true, all right? I'm not the type of person to just say I like what this genre of text has to say, so I'm all for it. I
Mm,
if it gives me that, like you're saying, that kind of remembering, and or gives me words for something I already knew or already had experienced and had sort of affirmed and verified through the phenomenology of the practice, then I will say, wow, okay, this is great. This is exactly what I'm experiencing. And I have somebody 2000 to 1800 years ago talking about it. So it's not weird or new agey or anything like that. It's right here in this ancient text. They're talking about the same things. And
mm,
one of the things that I like the most about Platonism is that it gives you this scaffolding. It gives you
mm,
this theoretical model for ontology, Platonism and Neoplatonism, and basically what it says, which we already know, words are kind of the more recent child in terms of human phenomenology, because there was
mm.
a time where we didn't have words. There was a time
Yep.
when we were just dealing in images, okay? So and there is this idea of the inherent image making capability of mind. So when I say
Mm,
mind, I'm not talking about brain, right?
mm,
I'm talking about capital M mind, which in our systems, in our worldview, is actually ontologically prior to matter. Right?
mm,
Mind is ontologically prior. It exists before matter does and creates a matrix within which what we call matter arises so that it
mm,
can then pour into it and inhabit it and experience things in a different way. Matter, the material cosmos, is the container that mind has made for itself. And so, but we kind of have reverse engineered that. Now, the key principle, right? I mean, Plato points towards what he calls forms or ideas, right? And they're abstract, but they are what he calls intelligibles. So
mm,
he basically classifies knowledge into two types. I mean, he classifies it into several types, but there's a line running through the center of it saying, okay, this is the lower, this is the higher. So there is sensible knowledge of the senses, that can only lead to opinion, doxa. It cannot lead to truth, aletheia. Okay, those are he calls sensibles. Okay,
mhm,
then there are intelligibles. Intelligibles are only things that can be grasped by the highest part of our soul, logistikon, and the nous, the mind which guides it. This is the rational soul. Now, we say rational, and the postmodern sort of perspective filter kicks in and says, red flag. Rational means God doesn't exist. It's a Cartesian, Darwin, socioeconomic kind of
mhm,
thing. Well, that's not the kind of rationalism. That's skepticism. That's a priori skepticism. We've taken a term and we've broken it. Rational, according to the ancients, was actually the faculty of the mind, of the soul, that allowed us to see the evidence of a God, of a creator, to see the brushstrokes, as it were, on the
mm,
painting of the creation. His thumbprint in the hardened mortar of the universe. And so by way of things like geometry and by way of things like these intelligibles. So Plato
mm,
in his Paideia, he talks about, okay, the education of the soul is the remembering and contemplation on the good. And that leads us from sensibles to intelligibles. And that's the whole thing of theurgy. Okay.
mhm,
Theurgy is going from sensibles to intelligibles phenomenologically, experientially. It's the same path as philosophy, except there's ritual employed. But uh, what that basically says is that images are the product of mind, and they are ontologically prior to both matter and words. So
Mm.
there's there's a part of us, right, that that existed without words, right? So what we're dealing with here in the things that we can't explain are actually they're coming from a pre-verbal source, a font, if you will, that is pre-verbal.
Mm.
Okay, so words cannot approach the nature of this. Only our experience and holding that experience, being with that experience and being present for it, that alone can help us to make sense of these things that we can't talk about because ultimately they are experiential, right? Because even if nothing happens, you don't have this big mystical experience where you see the light and the God appears to you. Even if it's something as simple and quiet as intuition, that's
Mm.
still an experience. This is why it's so sad that people keep outsourcing the locus of authority on what is real, definitively real, beyond their subjective experience. You don't die with the facts. You die with your experience.
Mm.
And I'm not saying one should ever supplant the other. You shouldn't go
Mhm.
around saying like, "Oh, I channeled this information and now everybody's got to, follow suit." That's the height of hubris and neurosis. But at the same time, these two things have to be allowed to coexist and even maybe hold hands and get along in your life. And
Mm.
and so that's really, there is a longing. And that is what we're sensing in Hebrew Kabbalah, right? Particularly, I think this is from the Breslovs, the Hasidim. They have the Tzimtzum, right? That expansion and
Mm.
contraction within the Ein Sof that creates the Korein, that space, that hole, that container I was talking about.
Mhm.
But now that light has been moved to the side, there are little sparks of remembrance in there, and
Mm.
those are called the Nikudim, the sparks of remembrance, and it's the Nikudim that ultimately spur us on to these adventures. It's that quote unquote Gnostic itch. In Platonism, it is the idea that the soul is ontologically prior to the material, and so therefore came into the material from a realm that is sort of coterminous with the thoughts of God, the realm of the soul and the intelligible realm. We passed through that, therefore we have had commerce with that. We know these things, and this is why Socrates says, particularly in the Meno, he does that little demonstration with the servant boy, and he basically says, "Look, see, the soul already knows everything, but we have in the process of incarnating, we have entered into a state of complete confusion." And this is said in many ways in the Gorgias. For instance, Socrates, very famously pits himself against this sophist Gorgias. So the dialogue serves as this contrast between sophistry and philosophy and their respective methodologies, sophistry being rhetoric, philosophy being dialectic. But there's this really weird aside. And he just kind of like turns and says, you know, I've heard it said that we who are in a body and yet think we live are actually dead. And that when we die, that is when we actually live. And so that from that we derive this idea of the soma sema paradox in Platonic scholarship, with the words that Plato pairs with each other for body and tomb.
Mm.
Uh, soma sema. Basically he posits this whole thing there and this little weird aside. And anytime Socrates does that in the dialogues, you got to pay attention. Anytime he breaks the narrative to do this little weird thing, that's very important. So what we get from this tradition is ultimately, it's elaborated in Hermetism, it's elaborated in Neoplatonism, is that the soul has entered a state of complete abstraction, confusion. It is now married to its antithesis, and it remembers somewhere that it came from the one and is trying to get back. And
Mm.
nothing here can accomplish that. It can help us, but only if we move from things sensible to things intelligible, meaning things we can talk about and things that we can only experience. And it's in that experience for me That's how I define Gnosis. The product of that experience is Gnosis. It's a knowing that I cannot explain, but has transformed me completely.
That's a really great answer to that whole thing. And I think the only other thing I want to add to that or bring up is that I think like there was something I really appreciated that notion of scaffolding. That's something that I've used a lot as a way to say that like to shift beyond the a demand of literalism when we talk about a lot of this stuff, that
Right.
it's like, oh, like on what dimension does the monad exist if the demiurge can create it? Like I'm like, that's these aren't, this isn't like a D&D cosmology, that naturally resolves in a simple way. It's demanding a kind of a wider view, and that this is not a the scaffolding helps you frame the thing you're trying to look at and talk about, but it is not the thing. Do you know what I mean? Don't confuse the
Yeah.
scaffolding for the thing it's supporting or that it's surrounding. But that other thing of like you're saying that like this sort of the pre-verbal and that like uh what also strikes me too is that I think there's also a chance to recognize that pre or non-verbal state is also always around us, if that makes sense. Like that
Mm.
we are that the mind is never gone. Do you know what I mean? We haven't descended from it necessarily, or at least not solely, in the sense that part of what we're doing, part of this like this anamnesis, this remembering, is an attempt uh, to touch again that experience that is kind of still always there, if that makes sense. Like uh, if all is one, then it's never gone. you know,
Yeah. Yeah,
at
I
least
mean, the
that's
thing
my
is
experience.
well, the thing is, again, the scaffolding that exists in Platonism and Neoplatonism is basically to resolve the Parmenidean dilemma.
Mm,
Socrates says in multiple of his in the epistemological dialogues, right, that have the Eleatic stranger as the chief interlocutor. He says that
mm,
Parmenides of Elea
mm,
is who taught him the dialectic. And Parmenides' main thing, right? He's called the father of metaphysics. His main question is, how does the one become the many? How
mm,
does that happen? Okay, and so all of Platonism is about working that dipole, that or at least a perceived dipole,
mhm,
working that
mhm,
out. And so you know that the way that various Neoplatonists talk about that, again, the symbolic images they give,
mhm,
Porphyry is a really good example, right? Or even Plato himself, Book 10 of the Republic, the last like 4 or 5 pages, depending on the typeset and the translation, you get the myth of Ur. The myth of Ur is that guy, that ancient soldier, dies on the field of battle. They put him on the funeral pyre. He wakes up. He says, "Guys, I died. I didn't just leave my body. I left the cosmos." And he goes on this thing, and he's not allowed to do with what all the other departed souls are doing, but he's with them and he watches them. And one of the things they do before they reincarnate is they drink of the river Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, and they forget everything that happens. And then they shoot off like stars into the night while they're sleeping with their daimons. Now, he doesn't tell us how we come back in, but Porphyry does. And Corpus Hermeticum 13 talks about this as well. And Olympiodorus and Iamblichus, they all have something to say about this. The descent of the soul, right? If you look at the Platonic cosmology, we have 8 nested spheres, concentric spheres. We call that the Ptolemaic model, whatever. It was the dominant cosmology for 1500 plus years. So it's a symbolic cosmology. They say when you enter into the cosmic realm, you are now entering into a realm of duality. The soul is whole, to your point, Jason.
mhm,
So it must be imparted with duality in order to be made suitable for incarnation. Who does
mhm,
that? The order, the clockwork of order, the thing which creates all ostensible order, right? Time is the sun, right? The diurnal cycle, that gives us the day, that gives us
mhm,
the night. Seasons, the annual cycle, that's the sun. The moon gives us a month, the lunar cycle. We've got,
mhm,
when Venus is in the east or when she's in the west, you can expect, the Nile to inundate it. The ancients would have looked at this stuff and said, "Oh my God!" They didn't have clocks. They didn't have digital, numbers to tell them what time it was. Depending on everything changed, depending on where the sun was, depending on where the moon was. So this to them that's the clockwork of the universe, and that is what imparts the soul with dualism, the archons. Okay, the sublunar archons, or the end cosmic gods. And so at each one of these planetary spheres, the soul would be brought, and it would be imparted with a binary. It would be or really a dualism, a vice and a virtue corresponding to the planet. It move on, vice and a virtue corresponding to vice and a virtue. And Porphyry says that these get put on the soul and make it heavy. He calls them accretions, but he also calls them astral garments. Okay, so now the soul is being conditioned by the garments of duality, which is the law of this realm. It's very Gnostic. And then finally it's tethered to the body. Corpus Hermeticum 13 calls these instead of a 7-fold system, it has a 12-fold system, which we could correspond to the zodiac. And they call them the tormentors of the soul. And there are these torments that get put inside of you as diamonds, as spirits that you have to cast off. You get something like the divine Pymander, right? That talks about what happens when the soul ascends. First, you cast off the body, then to the second sphere, avarice, to the third sphere, licentiousness, to the fifth sphere, whatever it is. And until finally you go beyond the 8th sphere and you praise God with the rest of the hosts of heaven. It's the same cosmology that they're talking about. And ultimately, what theurgy is supposed to do is to help you divest yourself of the specifically the vices, which are extremes. They're just extremes. That's a vice. It's not moralizing so much as it is, again, what does Socrates say in the Phaedo? Every pain and every pleasure is like a rivet which tethers the soul to the body. So it's not just talking about, when things are bad, don't worry, find the middle road. Just when things are good, don't get too happy. Stay in the middle, because you're still enthralled to the illusion when you're excited that something happened. So it's this whole idea of, again, as you mentioned, that middle path, that path of mildness that doesn't sound very fun, but actually is very fulfilling. And in my belief, the soul's purpose is to do that. So we get plenty of really incredible literature telling us how that happens, how to move again from the sensible to the intelligible. And there's lots of cool stuff across the traditions, but that's really what happens to the that's their way of talking about what happens to the their symbolic image for how the soul is conditioned by matter. Like it's not destroyed. It's not destroyed. It actually, there's a reason why throughout religio-philosophical mythopoesis, the soul is always relegated to a maiden. Right? Corey, Persephone, Psyche, even Eurydice, right? She gets bit on the heel right after they get married. They don't get to consummate their marriage. And she goes right into the underworld. So always a maiden, always this virginal thing, because nothing can truly corrupt it, but it can be conditioned.
Wow. That's great stuff. I don't have a lot to add to that, because I think there's just, I'm kind of chewing on it. I also made a bunch of notes. Also, I think, frankly, I don't know if I've said it on this show, but I've said it among some of the Gnostic groups that I'm part of, that I sometimes blame Plato for a lot, because I think this notion of the eternal realm of forms, the perfect realm of forms, is so seductive that it's it was its own sword in the tarot sense, that it was too seductive a symbol, and people sort of stop there. They don't think any further. They're like, oh yeah, okay, great. There's a perfect realm of forms. This realm isn't perfect, therefore this realm bad, that realm good. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's a falling into reductions. But a lot of what you've talked about here, I think I haven't deeply engaged with Plato, but I think you've given me a few more footholds to kind of grab onto.
You got to know that he did not give it all. Plato was somebody who he's Aristotle, right, who is not known for mincing words and for saying things that are kind of absurd. He was the empiricist. He was very stoic in the manner in which he spoke. As a matter of fact, laboriously so. It's very difficult for me to read him, but he says in his Physics and Metaphysics, there was in the Platonic tradition and the Academy, and he first person, he studied under Plato. He said there was an unwritten doctrine called agrapha dogmata, the unwritten doctrines. And Plato in his second letter actually says, and obviously the authorship is contested, but for all intents and purposes, in the second letter of Plato, he says the philosophy of Plato will never be written down. The dialogues are Socrates made beautiful. So there's a lot there that you're not going to get. Now, here's what's really interesting about that, and I'll keep this brief, but a lot of what I find in the Hebrew Kabbalistic tradition, because I have private teachers that I do one-on-one study with, or a teacher really, who I believe to me is a master Kabbalist in that system. He's shown me how much of it is Greek, how much of it and the words, the ideas come from the Hellenistic period. So the Alexandrian period. Okay. And one of the things that he said is he walked into a hall, a lecture hall with the Hasidim to study. And they have these long banquet tables, and there's two people or there's a bunch of people sitting on either side of the table, but it's always two people working together. And it's a master and a student, a rabbi and an acolyte, right? And they're just working on, they have these texts. And the big secret, or at least the axiom for them, is that the answers are not in the text. The texts are prompts for you and your student, or you and your teacher, to arrive at higher insight. And that is what? That is the dialectic. That is what the dialectic is. It's literally two minds or more working, right? And it's exemplified in the Platonic dialogues. That's why you go through pages and pages and pages of epistemological information and all this crazy stuff, and then you end up at the end of almost every dialogue, they're like, "Well, we didn't get anywhere, but we tried." It can be such a letdown to read some of this stuff. But so that to me is really interesting, is this idea that the texts themselves are for us to work the dialectic with each other on. And then they're not actually textbooks that tell us exactly what is real or what is not.
There's so much more to talk about, as always. We really love having the hours and hours long discussions about things that cannot be put into words. So but we will definitely have you back. It's been a real joy. And everybody listening, watching at home, you can help us keep the show going by patreon.com/Gnostic or paypal.me/Gnostic for a small amount of money. Chip it into us. We give you early access to the shows, and we have our new secret project that we're going to be talking about soon, where patrons will get a little bit. If you can't help us out financially, we understand. Just tell people about the show. Take this episode, shoot it over to a friend. You got somebody who loves Plato. You got somebody who already watches and listens to Ike and Arcanum, so they're gonna particularly love this show. So Ike, thanks so much. Let's do it again soon, and farewell, everybody.
Thanks for having me.